My name is Father Samuel Reyes, and on March 18, 2024, something happened to me that would change my life forever. I was a simple parish priest, living a quiet life in a small town outside of Valencia, Spain. I never imagined I would be chosen to carry a message so heavy, yet so full of hope. Today, I want to share with you what happened, not for my own sake, but because the world needs to hear it. I pray you'll stay with me until the end, because this story is not just mine, it's a calling for all of us. It all began with news that shook the world. Pope Francis had passed away. The sorrow was deep, stretching far beyond the walls of the Vatican. Millions mourned not just a leader, but a man whose heart had always beat for the forgotten and the broken. Yet, beneath the mourning, there was a strange and heavier silence, as if something greater had been left unsaid. Something that the world was never meant to miss, yet almost did. I had known Pope Francis, though back when I met him, he was simply Father Jorge Bergoglio. It was 1992, at a humble conference for young priests in Buenos Aires. I was barely finding my footing, unsure of my path, and there he was, steady, calm, and deeply rooted in prayer. Over the years, our paths would cross often, sometimes through letters, sometimes at quiet gatherings no one ever reported on. He was the same man in private as he was in public, gentle, humble, and always pointing the conversation back to God. On the morning of March 18th, I was busy preparing a charity event after Mass. It was an ordinary day, laughter, work, the smell of fresh coffee in the parish hall. No one said anything about the Pope. There was no whisper of grief, no sense of what had already unfolded on the world stage. As I walked back toward the church steps, a sharp pain stabbed through my chest. Everything spun, and before I could cry out, I hit the ground hard. The doctors later said my heart had stopped for nearly 3 minutes. But in those 3 minutes, I was not gone. I was standing in a place that felt more real than anything I had ever known, and before me stood Francis. He looked just as he always had, kind, steady, filled with a peace that made my own grief crash over me like a wave. I wanted to fall at his feet and beg forgiveness for not being there, for not knowing he had passed. But he simply lifted his hand and smiled in that familiar, tender way. "Samuel," he said, "don't weep for me. You still have work to do." He told me that there were things left unsaid, things he had carried quietly in his heart for years, waiting for the right moment. But that moment had come and gone for him, and now, it was my responsibility to speak. His words weren't harsh or demanding. They were filled with a gentleness that somehow made the weight of them even heavier. I knew right then that what I was about to hear would not be easy, but it would be necessary, not just for me, but for everyone willing to listen. Francis spoke of a church at a crossroads, a church that had forgotten the power of prayer in its rush to hold onto power and influence. His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming love he still held for a people who so often misunderstood him. He said that behind the walls of cathedrals and the noise of politics, the heart of Christ was growing faint in too many places. It wasn't about buildings or ceremonies. It was about souls wounded and wandering without true shepherds. And unless the church returned to its knees in prayer, it would continue to lose the very ones it was meant to save. He shared memories with me, simple ones, from long before the world ever knew his name. Late nights spent in prayer over broken families. Silent mornings weeping for the lost. Hours spent with those who could offer nothing in return but their suffering and their hope. It was never about the title, he whispered. It was always about the people, about showing them the way home. And in that sacred moment, standing there in the space between life and death, I understood him more clearly than I ever had before. He placed his hand on my shoulder and looked into my eyes with a depth I can't even begin to describe. "Promise me you'll tell them," he said. Promise me you won't let the noise drown out the whisper of God." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, overwhelmed by the burning in my chest, not the pain of my heart attack, but the pain of the mission I was being given. In that instant, the place around us seemed to shift, growing brighter, warmer, as if heaven itself was leaning in to listen. And then, just as quickly as it began, I was pulled back. I woke up in a hospital bed, gasping for breath, tears already streaming down my face before I even understood where I was. Nurses rushed around me, and machines beeped loudly, but none of it mattered. All I could think about was what I had seen, what I had been told. I remembered Francis's eyes, the way he had spoken with such urgency and tenderness. I remembered my promise, and deep down I knew that my life could never go back to the way it was before. I had been given a second chance, not just for me, but for a message far greater than myself. The days that followed were a blur of recovery, doctor's visits, and restless night. My family, the Reyes's, were there by my side. My brother Daniel, my sister-in-law Maria, my nephew Elijah. They all kept telling me how lucky I was to be alive, how close I had come to not making it. I nodded and smiled, but they didn't understand. It wasn't luck that had brought me back. It was a mission, a divine appointment. Every morning I would wake up with the same burning in my chest, not from pain anymore, but from the unshakable knowledge that I had something I needed to do. I began to write everything down, every word, every feeling, every moment from that encounter. I didn't want to forget a single detail. Sometimes I would sit at my kitchen table until sunrise, scribbling page after page, tears falling onto the paper. It wasn't easy to relive it all, but I knew I had to be faithful. Francis's final request wasn't about building monuments or starting movement. It was about reminding the church and the world that we have to return to the heart of Jesus, the simple, surrendered, prayer-filled life we were always meant to live. There were moments when I doubted myself, moments when I wondered, who am I to carry a message like this? I was just a small-town priest, not a cardinal, not a bishop, not a theologian. But every time those doubts crept in, I could hear Francis's voice again, calm and unwavering. "Tell them, Samuel. Tell them to listen for God's whisper." And that whisper became the loudest sound in my life. It chased away my fear. It reminded me that obedience doesn't require greatness. It only requires faith. As I started to share my experience with a few close friends and members of the parish, I realized just how much the world needed to hear it. Some would sit in stunned silence, tears pooling in their eyes as I spoke. Others would grip their rosaries tighter, whispering prayers under their breath, as if trying to soak in every word. It wasn't because of me. It was because their souls recognized the truth in the message. Deep down, every one of us knows when God is speaking. And what he was saying through Francis was simple. Come back to me. I remember one evening, sitting with my childhood friend, Matteo, who had long since walked away from the church. After I finished telling him about my encounter, he didn't say a word for what felt like forever. Then he looked at me, eyes red, and said, "Sammy, I think I need to pray again." That's when I knew this story wasn't just for the faithful. It was for the wandering, the broken, the ones who thought they were too far gone. It was never about shaming anyone. It was about calling them home with love. The memories Francis shared with me during that short encounter were so vivid. He told me about secret moments no one else had seen, sitting in slums with mothers who had nothing to feed their children, comforting old men who felt abandoned by the church, praying alone in dark chapels when the weight of leadership felt unbearable. He reminded me that the true church isn't built with stone and gold, but with hands that serve and hearts that break for the lost. His voice was steady when he said it, but I could feel the ache behind his words. He had carried those memories, those burdens, in silence for so long. And yet, even at the end of his life, He wasn't angry, he wasn't bitter. He was full of hope. Hope that the church could still remember who it was meant to be. Hope that we could strip away everything unnecessary and find ourselves once again kneeling at the feet of Jesus, just like lost children running back to their Father. That was the fire that burned in him until the very last breath he took. There was one moment during my encounter with Francis that I will never forget, no matter how many years pass. He leaned in close, almost as if he didn't want heaven itself to overhear, and said, "Samuel, remind them that the church's power isn't in its walls or its wealth. It's in prayer. It's in sacrifice. It's in love that doesn't expect anything back." His eyes were fierce when he said it, not in anger, but in the kind of passion that comes when a man knows he is speaking his final truths. In that moment, I realized how easy it had become for so many of us to forget the basics, the very heart of our faith. He spoke of how prayer had been his lifeline, especially in the later years when the pressure grew heavier and the criticism grew louder. Every decision he made, every word he spoke, he would first carry it to the feet of Christ in prayer. It was there, in those hidden hours when no one was watching, that God gave him the strength to keep going. "Without prayer," he said, "I would have been just another man in a robe, saying empty words." Hearing that from a man who carried so much on his shoulders shook me to my core. It made me realize how desperately we need to return to the quiet places with God. Francis also warned me about something darker, something most people don't want to hear. He said there was a growing coldness inside the church, a slow drifting away from true intimacy with God. Rituals without heart, preaching without love, leadership without humility. He said it was the devil's greatest weapon, not open rebellion, but quiet compromise, little by little, until the flame of faith becomes just a flicker. "Tell them," he urged me, "tell them that lukewarmness is more dangerous than hatred. It will steal their souls silently, without them even knowing it." When he said those words, I felt a fear that wasn't just for myself but for the whole world. It wasn't a fear meant to paralyze me. It was the kind that pushes you to action, that shakes you awake before it's too late. Francis wasn't trying to scare me. He was pleading with me, with all of us, to open our eyes and see the battle we're in. A battle not against flesh and blood, but against a slow death of the spirit. A battle that could only be won on our knees, in prayer, in surrender. Before he let me go, Francis shared one last vision that God had placed heavily on his heart. He told me about a coming day when the line between true believers and casual Christians would become impossible to ignore. Churches that once stood tall with thousands of members would feel empty, not because people left the building, but because they left their first love. He said revival would not begin with loud movements or famous leaders. It would start quietly, in living rooms, in hospital beds, in prisons, in broken hearts desperately crying out for God. The real church, he said, would be small but pure, a remnant burning brightly in the growing darkness. As he spoke, I could feel the urgency pounding in my chest. He wasn't just giving a warning. He was offering a hope that no matter how dark the world got, the light of Christ would never be snuffed out. It only takes a few truly surrendered hearts to change the course of history. He reminded me of the early church, when faith wasn't about popularity or comfort but about raw, unstoppable love for Jesus. He said, "Tell them they don't need to wait for permission to live this way. Tell them they already have it." He then spoke about his final days on earth, how he spent them not in fear of death, but in intense prayer for the church he loved so much. He said he prayed that we would stop chasing after titles and arguments and instead fall in love with the simplicity of the gospel again. "It's not complicated," he said with a small smile. "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else is just noise." I could hear the weariness in his voice, but I could also hear the fire that had never gone out. Finally, he looked at me one last time, and with tears welling in his eyes, he said, "Samuel, remind them that my greatest desire was not for a legacy, but for a church that would be ready when the Lord returns." His voice broke slightly, and in that moment, I felt the full weight of what he was handing to me. A responsibility that went far beyond anything I thought I could carry. But it wasn't about my strength. It was about his. And just like that, the vision faded, and I found myself gasping for air in the hospital bed once again. But something was different now. It wasn't just my body that had come back to life, it was my spirit. I knew deep down that my life had been given back to me for a reason, and that reason was bigger than anything I could ever imagine. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a messenger, a witness to something too powerful, too urgent, to ever keep to myself. Since that day, I've made it my mission to tell everyone who will listen about what I saw, about what I heard, and about what Pope Francis so desperately wanted us to remember. Prayer isn't optional. It's the lifeline. Love isn't a suggestion. It's the command. And faith isn't a performance. It's a surrender. I don't claim to have all the answers, and I'm not asking you to believe me because of who I am. I'm asking you to listen because the time we have to respond is running out. If you've made it this far into my story, I believe it's not by accident. I believe God is reaching out to you just like He reached out to me. Maybe your heart has grown cold. Maybe you've gotten caught up in the noise and forgotten the whisper. Maybe you've been waiting for a sign. Let this be it. Come back to Him. Start today. Start right now. Don't wait for tomorrow because tomorrow isn't promised. Before you leave, I want to ask you to do two simple things. First, take a moment to pray. Not a fancy prayer, just an honest one. Second, if this message touched you in any way, please share it. Leave a comment below with your prayer requests, and let's pray for each other. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this that God has placed on my heart to share. You're not alone in this journey. Together, we can walk back to the heart of God, step by step, prayer by prayer.